I'm the Doctor. I've lived many lives, and not all I'm proud of. Recently I went to my old house, Lungbarrow, and faced off against my cousins. I made sure that the house was no more by making it collapse into the dirt below, what I thought was forever. Ever since, I've been having nightmares of the hallucinations I saw in the Matrix when I faced the Master. Gallifreyan history, the day Torvik died, the day I left Gallifrey, the personalities that Zoanon had, my mother, and that one day my cousins could return, and so much more. All these nightmares are connected by one signal, one ever so familiar. I can't place when or where. Today is the day I find out just who I am. I don't have much time, but my answers should be arriving any minute now. Something or someone has been meddling with my timeline. Wherever this signal leads is where I shall find my answers. This signal and the culprit behind this chaos must be stopped at all costs. To find out what they plan for me and what's to come from what I thought I destroyed long ago. I've set myself up as my own therapist to locate when the signal started and what it has to do with when I left Gallifrey, alongside who the villain who has orchestrated this from the very beginning is exactly. Come in.
You called?
As your therapist, it's imperative that I ask you to arrive on time indeed, and not yesterday again.
As a time traveller, that is indeed a difficult task.
Shall we begin? In our last session, we were talking about your mother. You told me very little. Tell me more about her, and your childhood as a whole. What dreams did you have? What sort of a life did you lead?
When I was a boy, I always wanted to drive a steam engine. I was always fascinated by them, and their mechanics. My mother taught me the ways of science, and she taught me a lot in my time as a child. The memories often entangle themselves with other memories from around that time, but I know my mother's name was Penelope. That was it. And from what I remember, she built me a time machine. A fairly primitive one, but it was certainly a time machine. If only I could remember where or exactly when this happened. I remember my mother telling me a nursery rhyme about the glass, and they used to take me to their summer house, which was located on the other side of Christobolus. In some of my memories, she appears almost human, and in others, she is a Time Lord. In quite a few, it is as if she never existed, or I didn't know her.
Is that all you can remember? Perhaps self-induced memory loss? Perhaps something more? Did you suffer any trauma during your childhood? It's okay if you don't want to talk about it.
I remember a lightning strike and the building of the machine, but not much else. I was only a boy after all. On the subject of my parents, I don't really remember my father much, if at all, or what he meant to me, other than faint memories of when he showed me the stars, or cleaning up the web of time after one of his parties. I can't find any documents on them. Every time I close my eyes, I try as hard as I can to remember them. I can picture what they looked like sometimes. It is mainly my mother that I remember the most. My mother had red hair, and my father wore Time Lord robes, whilst my mother didn't during her early life, and that perplexes me.
Perhaps she wasn't a Time Lord. Perhaps she was a different species. You did describe her as distinctly human. Or perhaps as a Time Lord you never had a mother, and you're here on a quest for clarity and to find out who you truly are. I know I am. I think that she was your mother. You buried these memories into the dark abyss of your mind.
I do wonder if these are really just dreams of what I never had. Or perhaps they are dreams of what I want.
A dream of a normal life on Earth, a human mother, and a dream of riding a tractor one day. This all seems awfully familiar, but not in the same way as I'm thinking. Perhaps you're right about it being a dream, but you call them memories. You are certain in your judgment on them. From the moment you started talking about these memories, too certain. From a professional standpoint, I think you're wrong, and that you at some point did have a life on Earth. Memories and dreams are very different after all. Do you have any further memories of your childhood? Perhaps something locked away in an old house somewhere? Maybe an uncle or 30 worth talking about?
I remember sitting in the darkness in a cabin on Gallifrey throughout most of my childhood. I remember the academy, and if I truly think hard enough, then I remember being tested on for something, and it is unclear to me. I was so alone, and cold, and helpless.
So you remember multiple different takes on your childhood, but as a singular period of time. It's a worrying development in your case, and mine. It says here that you had a job on Gallifrey. So tell me more about the events that unfolded on Gallifrey, and your line of work on said planet.
In my early days on Gallifrey, I worked as a scrutinationary archivist for the Bureau of Possible Events.
What was that like? This is all very unusual, but intriguing to me. Tell me more about this job of yours.
I often got bored of the mundane days and the totalitarian attitudes of the High Council. I still disagree with them to this day, especially with the Castellan, breathing down my neck with his condescending attitude. I spent most of my time staring out of the window and looking at the bright orange sky, thinking about the hermit I once met. I was still lonely, even when working, and that fact reminded me of my childhood often. I spent a lot of it believing I couldn't be a real Time Lord, destined to become a Shobogan for the rest of my life, residing within the darkness I was ever so scared of.
It sounds like you went through a lot of trauma as a child, and as difficult as it may be, talking about it is brave and honourable. It is to my knowledge that Time Lords grew up in the Academy. Tell me more about that aspect of your life.
On most days I hated the place, and almost despised it. I did sometimes enjoy the Academy. Well, when the Master and I were pranking Barusa, who was our tutor, or forming a band named Gallifrey Academy Hot 5. I used to play the Pedagosto stick, while the Master would play the drums, even if he no longer admits or associates with the band. One day, I shall get it back together for a little reunion. The only times in which I was happy was when I was with my best friend and my first crush, the Master. Although he didn't go by that name at that time, there was also another friend of mine, named the Corsair. But when it came to my overall experience of the Academy, I would say that the Master was the friend who made it easier for me. Mostly because the Corsair mostly bugged off.
According to my databanks, the Master is a known criminal that came from Gallifrey with an enormous ego, and goes by numerous titles such as the War Chief. But according to these files, his main and most known title is the Master. You were his old friend, right? Care to expand upon that?
Our friendship was complicated, but it was the only thing that brought me any sort of happiness whatsoever. When we were together, it reminded me of how I constantly felt as if I wasn't included in anyone. And like anyone who doesn't feel included, I made it so by hiding away in the darkness. But that was the difference between the Master and I. I feared the darkness, while the Master revelled in it. I was just scared of it, and trapped within its emptiness.
And how did that make you feel?
I felt I could do nothing but cry in the dark. That was mostly to do with a bully of mine, named Torvik. Torvik used to bully the Master and I during our childhoods.
Tell me more about this Torvik.
Torvik was everything I despised in a Time Lord. He was pompous, selfish, decadent, and as corrupt as the rest of them. He hated me for being everything he despised in a Time Lord. He abused the Master frequently, and I no longer want to talk about him.
I know this is difficult, but we have to fight our battles, and the only way we could win is by moving on, and the only way we could do so is by talking about it. Your childhood and this experience are some of the many reasons you are who you eventually became. The Doctor. So spare no details.
The truth is, he was about to kill the Master. I had to do it. I had no other choice. He had to do it. Torvik was drowning me.
According to my records, all traces of him are now gone, completely erased, as if they'd been burnt out of existence. Do you know anything about that? This is completely confidential, and I need you to trust me.
Can we pick another subject to talk about, please?
Let's talk about your job once again. You were talking about it earlier. After the academy and your childhood, it says here that you had a family. And you didn't. The systems are unsure, but that is most likely a glitch in the system. You enrolled in this job of yours, so fill in the gaps for me and talk me through it.
All I had was said job, and a dream to explore the universe. The Master went down a path I simply couldn't follow, and we have grown distant from each other. Day after day, I just looked at the stars, as if I was expecting someone or something to whisk me away from this normal Time Lord life, damned to live a life of duty for 12 more regenerations of boredom, in which all I could do was reminisce about my past, that even I don't know everything about. Half the time, I thought about Penelope, intent that she was my mother, but then the name Tecteun comes to mind, or an ancient house.
Tell me about what you remember of this house, and this woman you named Tecteun. They're the parts of your story that I don't understand.
I don't remember much. I often have vivid flashbacks to that of Rassilon and Omega. I stood in the one place I can never see myself standing, beside them.
You have memories of Rassilon and Omega?
Indeed I do. As if I was there, at the creation of my people, multiple times.
Multiple times? Now how could that even be remotely possible? That perplexes even me. It takes a lot to do that.
I haven't the foggiest idea, dear fellow. Now, are you going to keep asking me these questions about what I can't remember? Or shall we carry on?
You must understand that this is imperative to your therapy. It's necessary to my understanding of you and your life. It's perfectly fine if you don't want to talk about these experiences, but every choice you have made has created you, as you are now. And to truly understand who you are, you need to fill in the gaps of what made the Doctor, the man you are now.
If you insist. All I remember about Tecteun is that she caused me great pain and suffering. She made me feel as if I were a labrat of sorts. I remember being employed at some point. By who? I can't remember.
Take your time. As Time Lords, we most certainly can.
I tell you, I don't remember anything else about this Tecteon, other than she was part of my childhood in some capacity, just as this house was, and just as my mother was.
I've obviously hit a nerve, but allow us to continue. You mentioned an ancient house of some sort. I just need you to trust me on this. Talking about this will help me to help you help yourself.
I remember even less about it, other than its name and a few faces.
What was the name of this house?
The word Lungbarrow is burnt into my mind. Every time I think about the house, it is cemented within the memory. I insist we move on to another subject.
What else did you think about it this time, may I ask? Take your time.
I thought about my granddaughter, Arcata, frequently, alongside my dreams of travelling the universe, and my memories of the distant past. I thought to myself that I should join one of the riots that Gallifreyan political activists who were aiming to lift the time travel ban and interact with species who aren't capable of said time travel. I often found myself at odds with the Celestial Intervention Agency or the High Council, who restrict time travel and believe Time Lords should merely observe the universe. They call it a non-interference policy, one that these riots and protests were against. Deep down, I knew that I couldn't, as this would make me a wanted criminal, and I would be ruthlessly hunted by the CIA. In turn, that would endanger my granddaughter, and I wasn't willing to risk it. There were only a few protests, and they only rarely happened at a celebration called Others Tide. I was awfully fond of the holiday, as it was the day I chose my name, on my naming day, but with every positive day comes a negative day. Others Tide was no exception, as the next Others Tide was the day that I looked into the untempered schism and looked into time itself. I remember when I ran away from it and never stopped. As it was later the day before it, which we called Others Tide's Eve, that I stole my ship, or perhaps it was Others Tide. The day I looked into the schism was when I found my barn and cried. The schism was painful, and the initiation was cruel. I didn't want any of the other children to see me crying, and this woman cared for me. The room around me was darker than ever, and I felt a hand underneath my bed when I lowered my foot, and a whisper in the dark that left an unarmed soldier by my bedside. One that I have within my pocket as we speak. But it was mostly one of the only days I had fun, as if it were my birthday. But I'm not too sure on that, or when my birthday is anymore. I much preferred it to the Feast of Omega or Rassilon, but for now I remained in my office, and alone, constantly alone.
According to my records, you had siblings. Did they not keep you company? You never mentioned them in the 5 sessions we've had.
I often got jealous of being locked in, whilst my brother, Rassilon, was traversing time and space freely. I refused to work for such a decadent bunch by failing my exams, intentionally of course, but eventually it caught up with me, and I had to work for them anyhow. I, Rassilon, and the Master often shared the same mindset, apart from the fact that none of us had a similar moral code, but another aspect we shared was a respect for one another.
Tell me more about your job and the Castellan that you were talking about.
I excelled at my job, but the Castellan saw me as a Time Lord who got easily distracted, and, naturally, the Castellan was right on their observation of me. I then stopped thinking about my contradictory childhood and my dreams, and often went back to focusing on my work.
Tell me, what did you do when you weren't working for the Time Lords? Although us Time Lords know that free time is a myth, what did you do while you weren't working? You mentioned you have a granddaughter. You must have spent time with her.
When I wasn't working, I used to take my granddaughter Archytire to Mount Perdition.
Why Mount Perdition in particular? There must have been a reason.
I used to play games with the master at his father's house, which resided on the slopes of the mountain. The house had long since been abandoned, but I couldn't help to check in every time. I used to tell my granddaughter about my sisters and a Type 40 TARDIS I had my eye on. I had a Type 50 model at the time, but I knew if I were to make an escape, I would need to make the Swifty 6 if possible. At one point, I had my mind set upon a Type 53 TARDIS, but perhaps my nostalgia got in the way, and eventually I decided upon the old Type 40 model, the one that I went on to describe, and always will describe, as the most beautiful ship that I've ever laid my eyes upon. It reminded me of my mother's time machine, but continuing to try and picture it for too long gives me a headache. Archytire and I often set up makeshift picnics on the red grass, and we looked in awe as the two suns set, a spectacle to behold on Gallifrey. I often told Archytire the same advice, and tales that the hermit that I once knew told me on a similar mountain. My gaze often lowered towards the barn I used to cry in. At least, that's what Archytire noticed, because she knew me extremely well. One day, I spontaneously decided to myself that I wouldn't allow myself to work for these corrupt, pompous officials any longer, that my granddaughter and I would pack our bags and leave this planet to become exiles in the fourth dimension.
What happened before you stole your TARDIS?
Before I stole my faithful ship, my nightmares grew stronger and almost felt real to me. What felt like flashbacks to past lives, with images such as rooms and experimental equipment, giving me a headache every time I decided to shut my eyes, as if someone or something was talking to me, calling out to me from within the darkness, a feeling somehow familiar to me, as if I was suffering from the worst case of déjà vu in history. The visions grew stranger as I got closer to my escape.
You were suffering from extreme nightmares, almost visions. Go on, tell me more about this time that these nightmares began to get stronger.
It was almost Others-tide, and I, alongside my granddaughter, decided to join one of the protests that I've always thought about joining when the time came. The CIA naturally disagreed with me and my actions, and put a bounty on my head. I was now a wanted criminal for the first time in my life. It got to the point in which I grew weaker from all the nightmares, and a feeling similar to loss had now taken over my head. As the headaches grew stronger, the visions I continued to see began taking the form of a silhouette in my mind. One that looked like an old lady from my childhood that gave me nightmares. It was hidden under a veil, but the rags that covered it were made out of beams of light that I couldn't fathom. Within them were the nightmares and memories that I was trying desperately to avoid.
Why was it in your mind?
It was calling to me, and then behind it was a casket. The casket then began to open, and a beam of light began to etch out of it. The if it wasn't in my mind, that it almost certainly would have blinded me. The light then formed into a figure, and then, as if by memory, I recognized it, almost automatically.
There were rumours that the Hand of Omega was alive, a living being encased in a casket, a weapon capable of unfathomable destruction, an unlimited rice pudding, perhaps. I wouldn't know.
This wasn't the Hand of Omega calling out to me. It was something different, something horrifying.
How can you be sure? Have you ever seen the Hand before?
No, but the connection between the Hand and I is more than just looks. It recognized me. I remember one night in which the entirety of the capital was awoken by an alarm that couldn't be turned off. An alarm created by Rassilon, in case the Hand was stolen. The Hand made its way to my dorm, almost as if it recognized me. It did so for a week, and continues to roam the corridors every time it does.
Thus I assure you that the reason that you knew this wasn't the Hand is because the Hand recognises you. Thus you'd recognise the Hand when you saw it. It appears that you do indeed have a strong connection to this Hand of Omega. Do you remember any reasoning for this?
I have no idea why the Hand recognised me. All I know is that it did. All I know is that I'm the Doctor, and I was born on Gallifrey.
You don't seem certain in that. I still find that odd and somewhat worrying. You were telling me about the Hand of Omega.
There is nothing more to say on the matter, other than it was sealed in obsidian, and yet still escaped.
Perhaps it was let free by an outside source. Doesn't matter. Tell me about the day that you finally decided to go ahead with stealing your TARDIS.
Gallifrey was in chaos at the time. Riots and cults rampaged through the Citadel. It was against everything the Time Lords believed in. Order was no more for the time being. It was the perfect time for Arcatar and I to escape. I woke her up, and we ran as fast as we could. The guards were after us, and there was a constant barrage of explosions as we made our way through. We knew we had to leave. We made our choice, and we went for it. The Hand of Omega was still calling to me, and I knew I couldn't leave it in the wrong hands. I could sense it, following me. Therefore, I stole it. We almost got into the wrong TARDIS. If it weren't for one of the friendly guards, then we wouldn't have chosen the one I'd laid my eyes upon, and allowed for the Hand of Omega to catch up. My granddaughter and I have been travelling ever since.
Did you ever find out about your mother, Penelope, or Tectune, or what Lungbarrow is?
There was a time in which I came close to finding out the truth, but the memory is hazy.
Take your time. Your therapy session has been extended. Tell me what happened after you left Gallifrey.
I went on a few adventures with Susan. Susan is her new pseudo name, and it took me a while to get used to it. Some adventures I would accidentally call her by her real name, or even an alien translation of it. After stopping the Time Lord in charge of destroying my ship, the visions began to get stronger, calling to me like a beacon.
And like all beacons, you decided upon following it. I know I would.
Indeed I did. Curiosity is one thing that runs in my family. It almost killed my sisters, in fact. I think it did once. But that is a story for another time.
What happened when you located where or when the signal was taking you?
I'm beginning to remember now. My memories are somewhat hazy, but as if they were a jigsaw. The fragments are being pieced together and are forming a bigger picture.
Take your time. Fancy a jelly baby.
The signal took me to a few planets before taking me to the old house we were talking about in our previous conversation. And it was there in which I found a woman named Leela. At every destination, I learned something new about myself and where the signal was heading. Leela was being held captive at the house by genetic experiments naming themselves as the special executives created by Rassilon, claiming she was my mother, while she resisted and claimed she was Leela of the Sever team and a guard of Romana. There were two more hostages behind them. One was wearing a vegetable, and one was wearing a bow tie. But I was knocked out, of course, before reaching the house, and it was there that I would remember the terrible deed, that I would learn the truth about my friendship with the Master, and face an old bully in battle.
This is impossible. That never happened. It appears as if my fears of what's to come and what's happened are correct. That the very fate of the universe is at stake, and I'm tangled within a web of chaos and destruction that started from the day of my creation. But time isn't as simple as once thought.
You speak as if you know my life already. Who are you? You also seem to speak gibberish for a therapist. And since when did I have a therapist, eh? Tell me at once.
I know your story, but it's best to express your emotions. Actually, perhaps it's better you did know the truth. I know your story, because I'm your future.
You are my future? Why ask pointless questions?
Because you're right. That calling was not the hand of Omega, and you've never been to therapy. I've been sent back in time by Romana before I attend the trial of our old friend and enemy, the Master. Someone is causing chaos all throughout our timeline, and something is incredibly wrong.
That doesn't answer my question.
Oh, but it does. Our timeline is complicated. We're a complex space-time event, and someone is using that. A puppeteer of immense and unparalleled power has sent you that beacon, that signal calling out to you. Ever since, it's been causing chaos and intends to use our history from the moment we were conceived to their advantage. Every decision creates ripples, and the one that this entity are causing are colossal.
So why ask me these questions? You must know the answers. You must.
Don't you see? The adventure you're about to talk about never happened, and yet it did. Your complicated history in which every important moment in your life has contradictions that even I don't know about, which is worrying, because I'm your future. It's my life. Time isn't as simple as we thought it was, and someone or something is toying with it and us. I need to know where the signal leads, and just how far back it went. Which is why I'm talking to you now. Tell me your story, and I can face the unimaginable evil that awaits us. Tell me about when you returned to Lungbarrow. Tell me about when you returned to Lungbarrow.